Class, this will be our final presentation for the school year as we try to draw everything that we've talked about to a head, if you will. And as we look at the postmodern era of the church, this is just our third lesson, but we're out of time. And so I want us to consider the expansion of global missions and really ask a question. What's the future of church history? Because there is a future to church history. And we started this year off with a call to global missions. We spoke about really the core of the center of the concentric circles of church history is a promise that Jesus will build his church. And so, as I said then, I repeat now, we are living in church history. This is not just something that happened 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago or even 20 years ago. Right now, as you listen to this, we are living out the building of the church. We're living out church history. And in some sense, you and I get to really play a part and decide what's the future of the church going to look like. We don't determine if it will rise or fall, but we do have a role to play. And so what I want to do is just show you several images and just kind of talk through them. But I want you to think about where the gospel is going to go next. This is an amazing image. The green represents the established Christian church throughout the world. Look at North America. It's a reached people group. South America, we look at Southern Africa, Australia, parts of Eastern Asia, all very much reached. But as you go to yellow, it's formative. There's a little bit of a church presence there. Now think about so much of that yellow in Southern Europe and all that took place there. Think about church history. Why is that the case? What does the 30 Years' War have to do with that? What does the Crusades and whatnot have to do with that? What about the Northern Africa that is red, that is unreached? 1,600 years ago, that was part of the epicenter of Christianity. But look at what's happened. That red is unreached or the least reached group of people among those living on earth right now. But it's also one of the most heavily populated areas of the world. And so some of you have heard of the 1040 window. This is along these parallels across if you looked at a map of the globe along these parallels, this is where the world unreached people predominantly reside, right there in this list. And look at that. Wow, that is staggering. But there's different maps, but it all shows a similar thing. And here, this would be the 1040 window here. And in that red, just imagine how many people have never even heard the gospel. In many countries, there are people who do not know a Christian. I want you to think about that as we think about the future of church history. And so we want to look at some missional trends and facts. And I have just found some very helpful resources from the Joshua Project. All of these slides, I think for the vast majority of them, come from the Joshua Project. You can see a link at the bottom if you Google Joshua Project. Some very, very helpful information. And I just want you to, hopefully my cursor is showing up. But let's just walk through this slide briefly. Number one, estimated non-Christians per missionary. Unreached block in the tribal and other areas of the world. For every, look there, 15,000 non-Christians per missionary. Could you imagine trying to be responsible reaching 15,000 people? Well, in the parts of the world where Hinduism is the largest, sect of that group, there's 175,000 people per Christian missionary. Or what about Muslim? 300,000. So if you ever stop and think, wow, do we really need more missionaries? Do we really need more churches? Do we really need to focus on the unreached around the world? Don't we have unreached here in America? And yeah, we do have the unreached here in America, but they live in I'm going to back up. They live in the most reached region of the entire world. Think about that. So I dare say, and maybe this is a little risky to say, when we begin to use that argument, well, we have people here that need the gospel. Guys, that's an excuse, and a lame one at that. If you and I make that excuse, it is lame, to say the very least. And it also is I'm just being honest, it's lazy. And it might be prejudice. There could be more involved there. So I'm being a little bit just kind of real there, but let's stop and think about that because the numbers do not lie. The people around the world are not hearing the gospel. Look at this number 5, and we'll back up. 81% of the world's Hindu, Muslim, and Buddhist do not personally know a Christian. But didn't Paul say in Romans 10, how are they to hear if no one goes? Think about that. And what we find is the number of non-believers is growing. Now, why is that? I'm going to speculate for a moment. One of the reasons I think the Muslim population, and I've read this in multiple places, is growing so rapidly, especially in comparison to the Christian population, is because they outbirth us. They outbirth us. And sometimes it may be in as much as 2 to 1. They outbirth us. And so the non-Christian population is growing at an alarming rate, in part because the Christian population is not growing, not only through a failure to evangelize, but also to actually have children, raise them in a Christian home. This is interesting, number 3, that there is a shift to the global south. Look at 1800, 99% of evangelicals in Europe and North America, only 1% in the global south. Skip all the way to this year, 2020. Look at that. 99%, it's gone to 22%. 1% has in what 220 years has gone to 78%. It's almost completely flipped. There is a transition. America is not necessarily the most Christian nation from a numbers perspective anymore. That is rapidly changing. And look at the allocation of funds. Giving to foreign missions per work among unreached people groups, 1%. And so where churches in America in particular funnel most of their missions money, it's to reached people groups. Now, there are people there that still need Jesus, no doubt. It's not an unworthy work, but it's not going to those who are in the most desperate need in the sense that they don't even know a Christian. Now stop and think about that. And when we think about people groups, I'm not going to have time to work through all this, but God called us to go to the nations. And the word ethne, it's where we get the word ethnic from. And that's the word he's using for nations. And so what is a people group? People group is in the sense that in for evangelization purposes, a people group is the largest group within which the gospel can spread as a church planting movement without encountering barriers of understanding or acceptance. And so I know I need to send these links out, but you can find this on the Joshua Project as well. This gives some great information on defining a people group and why we use them. I think this slide I can work through easier to explain this. Let's use the country of Nigeria and why people groups are so important. And there's that word, you can see it better here. Therefore, go and make disciples of all the nations, ethne. That's a people group. When we think of Nigeria, this isn't a political perspective, it's one country. But when we look at it as a highlighted group, an ethne for perspective, as opposed to a political perspective, there are over 540 distinct people groups. And each one of those people groups needs a church planting movement in their midst, needs to be happening right there in their local community. This is because the language is going to change. There's different tribal movements here and presence here. And each one is unique, and each one needs a gospel presence. And so from a reached perspective, look at this. It's largely Muslim in the north, Christian in the south, but in the middle, there's all kinds of conflict. So you see it's a people group map and a people group focus, which is what Jesus was calling us to do, that helps us to see there. And what's the future of the church? How are we going to reach these individual people groups with the gospel? It's imperative that we understand what it is we're tackling. I want you to look at a couple of final statistics. I think this is helpful. 10 countries with the largest Muslim populations, 2015 and 2016. Indonesia and India, Pakistan are right there at the top. 219 million in 2015. 87% of the country's Muslim. And that's 12% of the world's Muslim population is in Indonesia. India overtakes this by 2060 is the projection, where 20%, almost 20% of the world's Muslim population will live in India. And so we're talking in 2015, 1.7 million, but by 2016, nearly 3 million. This is a large number. That is basically 100% growth in the next 25 years. Look at this next one. 10 countries with the largest Christian population. US, 248 million in 2015, but only 262 million. Now, yes, that's growth, but is that what we would consider staggering growth? No, not by any stretch of the imagination. And look at that, we're looking at a world total of Christians in 2060 as just 3 million. But let's back up. That's almost equivalent. In 2015, 1.7 million Muslims, 2.2 million Christians. But look at how that gap is projected to be narrowed. Christians, 3 million, just over 3 million. Muslim, just under 3 million. And of course, these are projections, but that's kind of staggering when you stop and think about it. I talked about them outbirthing us. I hate to say them, the Muslim population outbirthing us. Listen, it's not only that, it is a lack or a failure to pursue global missions. What were some of these numbers? Let me back up. Where was it at? Right here. 81% of the world's Hindu, Muslim, and Buddhist population do not personally know a Christian. This number right here, guys, your generation needs to help us lower this number. This number needs to be more manageable. Jesus said he's not coming back until the world has heard the gospel. We know that. And so until every people group has been reached, we need to go reach the people groups. These numbers need to change. This number in the red needs to go up. Our churches need to be about supporting global missions to unreached people groups. Right? There are people out there that are feeling called to this, that are going there. Look, you and I might not go reach an unreached people group. Not long ago, I spoke with a missionary in Central to South Asia, and he spoke about trying to get. He's actually been to some groups that have literally never, ever heard the gospel. He said it was mind-blowing to stand there and to try to talk to someone, to communicate to someone who's never even heard the name of Jesus. They have no frame of reference for the gospel. That's hard for us to imagine in our affluent lives, in our Bible-saturated worlds. But there's people out there. What's the future of church history? There's people out there who've never heard the gospel, but you and I have it. I want you to look at this. Clarifying the remaining task. I'll let you look at this, but I want a couple of things I'm going to pull from it. 60% of the world population lives in reached people groups. 40% of the world population lives in unreached people groups. That's a large population. For every 30 missionaries that go to the reached people groups of the world, roughly one missionary gets to goes to the unreached people groups. 30 to 1. It's a staggering number. That number needs to change. How can you help change this number? How can your generation help change this number? How can you encourage your pastors, your friends, your family members, your church members to help the church lower this number? What if we could get that number to 15 to 1 or 10 to 1? It can happen in your generation, but you have to have a missions mindset. You have to take what we've learned from church history and realize that it's not just history, it's the future. We are living out the growth, the expansion of the church. So what will the future of the church be? All right, you get to speak to that. All right, you get to speak to that. And this is the verse that we started the whole year with. Jesus looks at the disciples and he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus answered, "You're right. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock," and I believe that means the rock is not Peter, the rock, it's a play on his name, but it's the fact that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he says, "On that rock, I will build my church, and nothing's going to prevail against it." You and I, as Christians, if you're a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, we must jump on this pursuit, join Christ in building his church. That's church history.